The golden bells above the restaurant door chimed softly as the old man stepped inside. His worn shoes scuffed against the polished marble floor, his figure frail and slightly stooped. He paused, eyes wide, taking in the grandeur of the place, crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, velvet-draped windows framing the bustling street outside. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly baked bread, delicate spices, and rich wine. Soft jazz played in the background, mingling with the hushed voices and laughter of elegantly dressed patrons. The old man took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the brim of his hat, his shoulders trembling slightly. His clothes were neat but faded, his trousers worn thin at the knees, his sweater fraying at the cuffs. Yet, he stood with quiet dignity, his eyes gentle, his posture humble. He approached the counter slowly, his footsteps soft, almost hesitant. A young waiter stood behind the counter, his hair perfectly coiffed, his uniform pristine. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the old man's appearance. For a moment, the old man said nothing, his gaze drifting to the menu hanging above. His eyes lingered on the lavish dishes: filet mignon, truffle pasta, lobster bisque. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he finally spoke, his voice soft and trembling. "Excuse me, could I get a sandwich, please?" The waiter's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes gleaming with disdain. His voice was cold, sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "This is La Belle Maison," he said slowly, his words dripping with contempt. "We don't serve sandwiches here." The old man's shoulders sagged, his fingers tightening around his hat. He looked down at his worn shoes, his face flushing with embarrassment. I can pay for it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The waiter's laugh was harsh, echoing through the room. He crossed his arms, leaning against the counter, his chin held high. "Oh, I'm sure you can," he scoffed, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "With what? Your pension check? Loose change?" A few patrons glanced over, their eyes curious, their lips curling into amused smiles. The old man's face grew pale, his shoulders hunching further, his eyes flicking toward the door. He took a step back, his feet shuffling awkwardly, his body trembling. I didn't mean to cause trouble," he stammered, his voice cracking. I just wanted something simple." The waiter's gaze was icy, his mouth twisting into a cruel grin. "Well, we don't serve simple here. We serve the finest cuisine to the finest people." His eyes raked over the old man's clothes, his voice lowering to a whisper. "And you don't belong here." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp and merciless. The old man's head dropped, his fingers trembling as he clutched his hat to his chest. His lips parted, a soft sigh escaping as he whispered, "I understand. I'm sorry." He turned slowly, his back hunched, his feet dragging across the floor. The golden bells chimed once more as he stepped outside, his figure fading into the bustling street. The waiter smirked, his chest puffed with pride, his head held high. He turned to his colleagues, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Did you see that? The nerve of some people." They laughed, their voices cold and mocking, echoing through the lavish room. But outside, under the pale sunlight, the old man stood still, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. His fingers tightened around his hat, his lips pressing into a thin line. He turned slowly, his eyes lingering on the glittering windows, the elegant chandeliers, the smiling faces. His gaze hardened, his jaw tightening as he whispered, "I'll remember this." And with that, he walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the crowd. Inside, the waiter continued to laugh, his voice haughty and cruel. But he didn't hear the old man's words. He didn't see the resolve in his eyes, the promise in his voice. He didn't know that the man he had just humiliated was far more than he seemed. And soon, he would learn just how costly his judgment would be. The laughter echoed through the restaurant long after the old man had left. The waiter leaned against the counter, a smug smile playing on his lips. He crossed his arms, his eyes glinting with satisfaction as his colleagues gathered around him, faces alight with amusement. Did you see the look on his face? The waiter sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. He really thought he could just waltz in here and ask for a sandwich. One of the other waiters chuckled, shaking his head. Unbelievable. This is La Belle Maison, not some greasy diner. The waiter's chest puffed with pride, his arrogance palpable. I did him a favor, really. Saved him the embarrassment of not being able to afford the water here. They laughed, a chorus of cold, heartless amusement. None of them spared a thought for the old man, the way his shoulders had sagged, the way his hands had trembled as he clutched his hat to his chest. None of them noticed the way his voice had cracked when he apologized, his words heavy with shame. They were too busy basking in their own superiority, their eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. But outside, standing under the pale afternoon sun, the old man was still there. His frail figure cast a long shadow on the cobblestone street, his face turned toward the glittering windows. His eyes were sad, his lips pressed into a thin line, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his humiliation. He watched them laugh, watched the waiter's smug face, his chest heaving with pride. He watched the elegant patrons raise their glasses, toasting to their wealth and privilege, their laughter loud and carefree. The old man's fingers tightened around his hat, his knuckles turning white. His jaw clenched, his breath catching in his throat. He had been poor once long ago, before he earned his first fortune. He remembered the looks people gave him then, the way they dismissed him, looked through him as if he were invisible. He thought he had left that behind. But now, standing outside this restaurant, he felt it all again, the shame, the hurt, the anger. It burned through him, hot and bitter, searing his heart. But he didn't look away. He stood there, watching them, his body trembling, his soul aching. His eyes burned with tears, but he refused to let them fall. He had made a promise once, to never forget where he came from. To never let his wealth blind him to the humanity of others. To never judge someone by their clothes, their appearance, their station. But today, he had been judged. Today, he had been looked down upon, laughed at, humiliated. Today, he had been made to feel small, worthless, nothing. His fingers dug into his hat, his nails biting into his palms. The pain grounded him, steadied his heart, cleared his mind. He would remember this. He would remember the waiter's sneer, his cutting words, his cruel laughter. He would remember the faces of those who mocked him, their eyes gleaming with disdain. He would remember the shame, the anger, the pain. And he would make them remember, too. He turned slowly, his body rigid, his steps heavy. The golden bells chimed softly as another patron walked into the restaurant, their laughter floating out onto the street. But the old man didn't look back. His figure grew smaller, his silhouette fading into the bustling crowd. But his presence lingered, a shadow in the sunlight, a whisper in the wind. Inside, the waiter continued to boast, his voice loud and arrogant. I did him a favor, really. People like that don't belong here. He laughed, his eyes gleaming, his head thrown back in confidence. He was invincible, untouchable, superior. He had power, status, wealth. He was better than the old man. Better than anyone who couldn't afford to dine at La Belle Maison. He had won. But outside, in the crowded street, the old man whispered softly, his voice carrying on the wind. I'll remember this. The waiter couldn't hear him. He was too busy reveling in his own victory, his own pride. But the old man's words hung in the air, wrapping around the golden bells, seeping into the walls, echoing through the lavish dining room. A promise. A warning. I'll remember this. And one day, the waiter would hear those words again. One day, he would feel the weight of his arrogance, the sting of his judgment, the pain of his cruelty. One day, he would face the consequences of his actions. But today, he laughed, his voice loud and cruel, his pride blinding him to the truth. Today, he was the victor. But tomorrow, the tables would turn. And the man he had humiliated would become the man he could never forget. 3 days had passed since the incident at La Belle Maison. The waiter was back at his post, his uniform pristine, his hair slicked perfectly in place. He moved through the dining room with practiced grace, his charming smile winning over every guest. The memory of the old man's humiliation had faded from his mind, replaced by the applause and admiration of the wealthy patrons who adored him. He felt powerful, invincible. To him, the old man was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a laughable fool who dared to step into a world where he didn't belong. A forgotten face in a crowd of nobodies. Until the letter arrived. It was a Friday afternoon, just before the evening rush. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays through the restaurant's grand windows. The door swung open, the golden bells chiming softly as a man in a sharp suit stepped inside. His presence commanded attention. He moved with authority, his eyes cold and calculating as he scanned the room. In his hand was an envelope, sealed with a golden emblem that shimmered under the sunlight. The waiter approached, his face the picture of politeness, his voice suave and confident. "Good afternoon, sir. May I help you?" The man's gaze was icy, his voice clipped and formal. "I'm looking for the owner of this establishment." The waiter's confidence wavered, his chest tightening with unease. But he quickly recovered, his charming smile never faltering. "Right this way, sir." He led the man to Monsieur Laurent's office, his steps graceful, his posture proud. He knocked once, his voice firm and steady. "Monsieur Laurent, there's a gentleman here to see you." The door opened, and Laurent's face appeared, his eyes curious, his lips curled into a welcoming smile. "Ah, a visitor. Please, come in." The man in the suit stepped inside, his presence filling the room, his eyes cold and unyielding. The waiter hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but his pride kept him rooted to the spot. He wanted to see what this was about, to satisfy his curiosity. The man extended the envelope, his fingers long and elegant, his demeanor detached. "This is for you, Monsieur Laurent. It is from the office of Charles Devereux." The name hung heavy in the air, wrapping around the room like a shroud. Laurent's face paled, his eyes widening in shock. "Charles Devereux," he repeated, his voice trembling. But he died earlier this week." "How?" The man's expression did not change. "Yes, Monsieur Devereux passed away 3 days ago. This letter contains his final instructions regarding this property." Laurent's hands trembled as he tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the elegant script. His face grew paler with each line, his mouth falling open in horror. His body swayed, his fingers clutching the desk for support. "No. No, this can't be," he whispered, his voice hollow and broken. He owned this building?" The man's gaze was cold, his words merciless. "Yes. Charles Devereux owned this property, as well as half the buildings on this street. He was one of the wealthiest men in this city. A billionaire." The waiter felt his blood run cold, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, his body freezing in place. No, it couldn't be. The old man's face flashed before his eyes, tired, weary, gentle. His worn clothes, his trembling hands, his frail posture. His quiet voice, his whispered words. "I just wanted a sandwich. I can pay for it." The room spun, his vision blurring as the truth crashed over him. The old man he had humiliated, the man he had mocked and insulted. He was Charles Devereux. He was a billionaire. Laurent's voice cracked, his body shaking with fear and disbelief. "The letter, it says, he wants the restaurant shut down. Immediately. Our lease is terminated. We have to vacate the premises within a week." The waiter's knees buckled, his heart sinking. This was his fault. His arrogance, his cruelty, his judgment. He had humiliated a man who could buy and sell this entire street without blinking. He had judged a billionaire by his clothes, his posture, his humility. And now, he was paying the price. Laurent's hands shook, his eyes wide and vacant. He wrote that this was his final wish. That his property would no longer serve those who looked down on others. He named you specifically, he whispered, his voice hollow. He wrote about you. He wrote about the way you humiliated him. The waiter's body trembled, his mind spinning, his chest tight. He could barely breathe, his world crumbling around him. I didn't know. I didn't. The man in the suit's gaze was cold, his words sharp as daggers. You saw what you wanted to see. You judged him by his appearance, his clothes, his age. You humiliated him twice. And now, he has humiliated you. The words pierced him, cutting through his pride, his arrogance, his confidence. He felt his legs give out, his body collapsing to the floor. He looked up, his eyes wide and pleading, his voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know who he was. The man's gaze was merciless, his voice cold. That's the point. You didn't know who he was. And yet you judged him. The waiter's heart shattered, his body shaking with fear and shame. The golden bells chimed softly as the man in the suit turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing through the empty room. The waiter sank to the floor, his head in his hands, his soul crushed. The room spun, his vision blurred, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The truth was suffocating, heavy, relentless. He had judged a man by his appearance. And that man had been Charles Devereux. The old man's words echoed through his mind, haunting him, crushing him. I'll remember this. And now, he would remember too. For the rest of his life. The restaurant was silent, a hollow echo of the bustling elegance it once held. The chandeliers hung lifeless, their golden crystals dull in the dim light. The tables were bare, the fine linens stripped away, the silverware packed in boxes. Only the hollow clinking of glasses being packed away by silent waiters broke the heavy stillness. The waiter stood in the center of the room, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. His uniform hung loose on his frame, the polished shine of his shoes faded to a dull scuff. He stared at the empty tables, his eyes hollow, his heart heavy. His world was gone. Monsieur Laurent stood by the window, his back rigid, his shoulders tense. His hands were clasped behind his back, his fingers trembling. He didn't turn around as he spoke, his voice hollow and defeated. This place. I built this place from the ground up. I made it into the finest restaurant in the city. And now, it's gone. All because of you. The waiter's breath hitched, his chest tightening. His throat burned, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? What could he possibly say to fix this? To undo the damage he had caused? Laurent's shoulders shook, his voice cracking. I lost everything. My reputation. My career. My life's work. And it's all because of your arrogance, your pride, your cruelty. The words were knives, cutting deep, tearing through his soul. His knees buckled, his body sinking to the floor. He covered his face with his hands, his fingers trembling, his heart shattering. He heard the door creak open, the golden bells chiming softly. His head jerked up, his eyes wide, his body stiffening. A man stood at the entrance, his silhouette tall and sharp against the fading sunlight. He stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His suit was immaculate, his posture straight and commanding. He held an envelope in his hand, sealed with the golden emblem of the Devereux estate. Laurent turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow. His lips parted, his voice trembling. Who are you? The man's gaze was cold, his expression impassive. My name is Richard. I am the executor of Charles Devereux's estate. The waiter's heart stopped, his breath catching in his throat. His body froze, his fingers digging into the floor, his chest tightening. That name would haunt him forever. Richard's eyes flicked to the waiter, his gaze cold and unforgiving. He extended the envelope, his voice sharp and formal. This is for you. It is Mr. Devereux's final message. The waiter's body trembled, his fingers shaking as he took the envelope. His heart raced, his vision blurring as he broke the seal. The paper was heavy, elegant, the writing neat and graceful. His eyes scanned the words, his breath catching in his throat. To the man who judged me by my clothes. To the man who looked down on me because of my appearance. To the man who saw only poverty where there was wealth. I leave you this lesson. You saw me as nothing because of the way I looked. Because I was old, because I was frail, because I was quiet. You laughed at me, humiliated me, shamed me. You saw only what your pride allowed you to see. You never saw the man I truly was. You never saw my heart, my soul, my humanity. You saw only the image you created in your mind. I gave you 2 chances to see me. Twice, I stood before you and showed you my need, my humility, my vulnerability. Twice, you turned me away. Twice, you chose arrogance over compassion, pride over kindness. And now, you must live with the consequences. I leave you this restaurant, stripped of its beauty, its wealth, its power. I leave you with nothing, just as you left me with nothing but shame. Remember this moment. Remember the way you feel right now, the pain, the regret, the loss. Remember it and learn from it. Because respect is not earned by wealth or power. It is earned by humility, by compassion, by humanity. It is earned by seeing beyond appearances. I leave you my lesson. I hope you learn from it. I hope you remember it. Just as I remembered you. The paper fell from his fingers, fluttering to the floor. His chest heaved, his body shaking, his soul crushed. His eyes stung, his vision blurred, his breath ragged. He sank to his knees, his body crumbling, his heart breaking. He remembered the old man's face, the kind eyes, the gentle smile, the quiet dignity. He remembered the way he had stood there, trembling, vulnerable, humble. He remembered the way he had walked out, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He remembered his words, soft and broken, his voice trembling. I'll remember this. The truth slammed into him, heavy and unforgiving, crushing him beneath its weight. The old man had remembered. And now, so would he. For the rest of his life. Richard's voice cut through the silence, cold and final. Mr. Devereux. Do not waste it. He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing through the empty room. The waiter stayed on the floor, his body limp, his soul shattered. The letter lay beside him, the words burning into his heart, searing into his mind. I hope you remember it. Just as I remembered you. His lips trembled, his eyes flooding with tears. He would remember. For the rest of his life. The restaurant was gone. The grand windows were boarded up, the golden sign torn down, the elegant chandeliers dismantled. Weeds grew along the cobblestone path, vines creeping up the walls, reclaiming the place that once radiated luxury. La Belle Maison had become nothing more than a shadow, a whisper of its former glory. The waiter stood across the street, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and hollow. His once pristine uniform was gone, replaced by worn clothes that hung loosely on his frame. His hair was unkempt, his shoes scuffed, his hands rough from days spent searching for work. He was invisible now. Just like the old man had been. No one looked at him as they passed by. No one acknowledged his presence. He was nothing, a faceless figure, blending into the crowd, ignored and forgotten. He could still see himself behind the counter, his head held high, his chest puffed with pride. He could still hear his voice, sharp and cruel, cutting through the air. We don't serve people like you. He had built his self-worth on the humiliation of others. He had looked down on people, judged them by their clothes, their appearance, their status. He had seen the old man as nothing because he had refused to see his humanity. And now, he was the one people looked through, walked past, ignored. Now, he was the one who didn't matter. He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling, his nails chipped and dirty. His heart ached, his chest heavy, his soul weary. He had been given the world, and he had thrown it away because of his own arrogance. He could still hear the old man's voice, quiet and broken, echoing through his mind. I'll remember this. He had lost everything, his job, his pride, his reputation. But what haunted him most was the opportunity he had squandered. An opportunity to show kindness, to show respect, to see beyond appearances. An opportunity to be human. He turned slowly, his eyes lingering on the boarded windows, the crumbling walls, the fallen sign. It was a grave now, a tombstone to his pride, his arrogance, his judgment. A monument to the man he used to be. A man he never wanted to be again. He walked away, his steps heavy, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. His shadow stretched long behind him, growing smaller, fading into the distance. He was nothing more than a silhouette now, a nameless figure lost in the crowd. But he carried the old man's lesson with him, etched into his heart, burned into his soul. He would live differently. He would live better. He would remember. I'll remember this. And he did. For the rest of his life. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the abandoned building. The boarded windows stood silent, the fallen sign lying crooked against the wall, the golden letters tarnished by time. Weeds wrapped around the crumbling pillars, nature slowly reclaiming the once grand restaurant. La Belle Maison was no more. But the lesson it held, that would never fade. The waiter stood at a distance, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and hollow. His eyes were heavy with sorrow, his heart weighed down with regret. He watched the broken windows, the cracked walls, the shattered remnants of his past life. He remembered the laughter, the applause, the admiration. He remembered the way he used to stand tall, his head high, his voice loud and arrogant. He remembered the way he looked down on people, the way he judged them by their clothes, their appearance, their wealth. He remembered the old man, his worn clothes, his trembling hands, his quiet dignity. He remembered his voice, soft and steady, his words heavy with pain. I'll remember this. The old man had remembered. And now, so did he. He would never forget the shame, the guilt, the loss. He would never forget the way his arrogance had destroyed everything he once held dear. He would never forget the man who had shown him the truth about himself. He had been given the world, and he had thrown it away because of his own pride. He had judged a man by his appearance, never once looking beyond the surface. He had been cruel, heartless, blind. And now, he was nothing. But he carried the old man's lesson with him, etched into his heart, burned into his soul. He would live differently. He would live better. He would live with humility, with compassion, with humanity. He would remember. For the rest of his life. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching longer, the world growing darker. He turned away, his figure growing smaller, his silhouette fading into the distance. He walked away from his past, from his pride, from his judgment. He walked toward a future shaped by the lesson he had learned. I'll remember this. And he did. Every day. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs to remember the power of kindness. Leave a comment below and tell us how this story impacted you. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge you, inspire you, and make you feel, don't forget to subscribe. Because every story has a lesson. Every story has a heart. And every story deserves to be remembered.